Josh Stone, are you there with us? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
My good friend, it's all up to you now.
The exact question that Don hit me with when I prepared this talk was exactly what's on the screen, perhaps minus an expletive. Thank you much for the glowing introduction. I'm not sure I completely deserve all of it. I always feel like I'm scrabbling at the edge of my own limits to understand things, and there are certainly a lot of people who know way more stuff than I do. Professionally, I work in information security. I am a researcher for a red team company. I develop command and control software to hack networks. And in the other time that I have, I am fascinated with analog electronics and RF, which was always a blind spot for me for many years. So about 7 years ago, I got heavily into software-defined radio and DSP, modulation, demodulation, that kind of stuff, and finally couldn't handle it anymore and had to get licensed so I could actually transmit stuff. So a few years ago, my 11-year-old son and I licensed stuff, and it's been a whirlwind of homebrew electronics ever since then. And if you can't tell, I really, really like CGA colors. I don't think we ever needed the video graphics array and beyond. So hopefully you can handle my preferences for colors and pixelation. So it is true that there are a whole lot of digital modes, and it's hard to actually find a single list. Like, it's easy to find the lists that are supported by FL-Digi. You can look at hamradio deluxe and some of the other software packages and see other lists of modes, and then lots of submodes and a bunch of bespoke one-off softwares that do other modes yet. And so I actually don't even know a good place that finds them all. But it seems like there could be at least one for every deck in or every card in a deck of playing cards. So why would there be so many, and how do we decide which ones are useful for our use case? And the first thing that I thought of when I thought through Don's question was actually kind of this. In a way, technical fields tend to the proliferation of lots of options. A lot of people have their own ideas about how something should be done, and often that just creates a glut of many options. And this isn't entirely untrue. I think there's a lot of people just doing stuff because they can. But then also, as I started to aggregate and collect information about all the different categories of digital modes out there, one of the things that I started to really feel about it is that in one sense, and this being a non-professional and amateur hobby, a lot of these digital modes are almost like an art form. There's like a form of creativity that goes into this stuff, and it's very expressive. Unfortunately, it has such a small audience. Very few people can look at these kinds of things and really understand the beauty in them. But some are like that. They're just pretty. And then some other ones that people use are very interesting from kind of a historical perspective. Like when we look at something like RTTY, which certainly has a lot of technical shortcomings in context with a lot of other modes that people use today. RTTY is very interesting. It has a lot of military connection. It has a lot of story and a lot of history attached to it. And then also my favorite digital mode of all is Hellschreiber. And that one you can't even say without just giggling inside because it's so much fun. And so these are interesting because of their history, and maybe in the sense of Civil War reenactments and other kinds of things. Maybe it's just fun to use stuff that has that historical significance. A lot of modes are purpose-built for some specific purpose. We'll get into some of those as examples as I go through. And then a bunch of them are really connected more to the advancing the art scientific inquiry side of amateur radio. And actually, in some ways, I feel like when you look at professional radio, there's a certain settling on a certain set of modulations and modes. And actually, I think amateur radio has a lot to offer in the sense that we're not trying to create the same thing that the professionals are doing. In some ways, we're just doing unique stuff that doesn't fit anywhere else. So sometimes I think we have some very fascinating ideas in what we're doing. Another way of looking at this would be to say, well, why are there so many digital modes? And one answer is that digital modes live in this multi-dimensional vector space of problem solutions. And there are a lot of reasons why one is different from another, or why one might have a compelling advantage. If you're trying to communicate with someone interactively, you want to communicate by keyboard and type some messages to them and get messages back. You want something that's really responsive. And that might be the most important thing for you, and that disqualifies a whole bunch of other modes. Or maybe you need a certain protocol there are some modes, and we just saw some fantastic stuff with FT8, which is built around a very rigid protocol. And that is there for a reason. It facilitates quick and efficient making of contact, potentially in weak signal and difficult propagation scenarios. And honestly, I even had to think through that, some of the solutions or some of the advantages of different modes even are kind of unquantifiable. Like some modes are just cool or popular. FT8 is certainly popular. There's no reason that FT8 versus FT9, FT8 versus FT4 are not, are like different from each other. It's just, one is more popular right now. Another one might become popular later. JT65 used to be popular. It's much less popular now. There's some of these soft, less quantitative aspects of what makes modes interesting or useful for different people. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think that expresses it. When you start looking at an actual list of digital modes, the reasons for their genesis becomes pretty apparent. It's not hard to find why somebody built these things. Joe Taylor, when he made JT65, was interested in EME and trying to make EME more accessible to modest stations. It turns out, as a consequence, that the things that make it good for modest EME also make it kind of good for weak signals on HF. And so as we get to the diminishing solar cycle and people struggle with more difficult propagation, suddenly that becomes useful for something for which it was never really intended in the first place. And then we can look at how movement to FT8 and other similar modes are even more adaptable to the HF making contacts problem. But then other modes like MSK144 are completely different in their design because they're designed for a specific propagation scenario. With meteor scatter, you have little spikes of propagation. And so this mode is designed with the idea that, well, we're going to blast a whole bunch of copies of our packet and hope during this transmit period, we manage to bounce it off one of those spikes and it gets through. And we interleave the transmit and receive. Maybe we think about which direction our antennas are pointing and whether it's the morning or not. And there's some protocol built around it, but it's for a specific purpose. Other ones like Whisper, which is one of my favorites to play with, is all about mapping propagation. It's not even bidirectional. It's a unidirectional mode. And I think there is actually a variation of Whisper that you can use to communicate. If you can handle doing a keyboard chat at 56 bits every 2 minutes, then maybe that even could make some sense, but it's really specifically built for a certain purpose. Some of the interesting modes, like Olivia comes along, and the idea for Olivia is, well, we'd like to use some of these neat ideas. We can use some different modulation ideas. We can throw in some error correction, and we can achieve something that has a really good weak signal performance, and it's still kind of performant in terms of speed and responsiveness. And then someone else comes along and says, the only problem with Olivia is that it supports mixed case and maybe some other little details. So let's make Contestia, which is just like a little evolutionary step beyond Olivia in a specific direction. Let's make it better for contests. But I think it's kind of fun just to look at a lot of the modes, even the ones I don't use, and try to understand, well, why did someone make it, and why did their design choices end up making it good for a certain use case? And speaking of use cases, I thought really, if you're going to approach this from a very practical perspective and say, how do I pick one? I think it's best to start with your use case. So first, if you want to make lots of contacts, then the answer is really FT8. You're going to look for a mode that has good weak signal performance. You're going to look for something that has a protocol that facilitates making contacts, but maybe isn't so free form and random that you are typing whatever message you want. That actually slows things down. And if you have an assigned sort of frequency area in the band, well, that aggregates everybody in one place. You don't have to scan through the band looking for stuff. All right, so based on the use case, we have some modes that match that exactly, and then those would be the natural ones to pick. You might say, I'm interested in testing propagation. And then you want something like Whisper or QRSS. And these are things that are specifically designed for a beacon sort of format. They're designed to be unidirectional. They don't really make any sense to transmit lots of information. And yet they can be quite fun to play with if that's what you're into. If you want to meet people in chat, which is my most fun thing, in some ways, I started ham radio so I could meet other nerds and talk to them about geeky stuff. Right. So I'm always looking for the rag chew. And so here you want something that's fast enough that you can feel interactive. and you want a free-form protocol. You don't want that 6-step automated sort of sequence that you have for FT8. Because in there, I want to find out how many kids the person has, and I want to know what they did for work, and how many acres they have that I wish I had too. That's the kind of stuff I want. Doesn't fit in that sort of regimented protocol. And then finally, I never really think too much about contests because I'm not particularly into it myself. But I will admit that one day, while looking through 40 meters, I saw some RTTY, and I thought, well, that guy's doing it for a contest. I guess I'll help him get some more numbers. And then I saw another one on the waterfall, and I said, I shouldn't leave him out, and one thing led to another. And half an hour later, I had like 30 contacts on RTTY. I'd never even done that before. And I actually began to see some of the appeal. So if you're interested in doing a digital mode contest, then it doesn't matter what the aspects of the mode are. You have to do whatever's in the contest. So your use case may very well drive which modes you find interesting. As for me, as I said, I like rag chews, so I want to talk to people. On the left, here's a conversation I had with a gentleman, I believe in Michigan, with about, I think I was running about 12 watts using FT8. And FT8 is actually fast enough that you can get some real conversation in, but it still works really well. For part of our conversation, half of my signal was overlapped by half of somebody else's signal, and we were still getting through quite well. So some of these modes can be very, very effective. On the right, this one's really popular these days. This is JS8. It's a version of, or a variant of FT8, where Jordan decided, FT8's great, but it'd be nice if it was designed for keyboard chat. It does some other things too, but I like to have rag chews on it. Works quite well. When we look at some of the modes, there are a whole bunch of different attributes that make modes different from each other. And so I thought I'd go through a couple of the performance aspects that are worth understanding and thinking about as you pick one. The first one I wanted to talk about was things like baud or symbol rate and bit rate and words per minute. Growing up in the modem days, as I did, I find it absolutely fascinating that one of my favorite modes ever runs at 2 baud. But it turns out that there are some reasons to run a really slow baud rate. If you want to work well in poor propagation situation, then the slower your baud rate is, the better. So that if you have interference getting in the way, your symbols are lasting longer to perhaps withstand that interference and be more detectable. But then when we're communicating and trying to send information, more bit rate is better. And so a lot of the digital modes end up making trades. They trade symbol rate for bit rate. So maybe instead of just having 2 frequencies and frequency shift keying really fast, we can have 16 frequencies, or like Domino has 18 separate frequencies to send 4 bits every symbol, and it sends 2 symbols every second to make 1 byte per second. So you can use these attributes of different modes to compare them. But then there's always, you could talk about your bauds, you could talk about your bits. But sometimes if we're on a keyboard, we just want to know how many words per minute is it going to make. And that gets even more complicated because we can't just think of a character, a keystroke, as being a byte. A lot of the digital modes use varicodes, so some symbols are shorter than others. If you're using some of those, I find myself never sending capital letters if I can avoid it, because usually lowercase letters are going to be a little bit faster. But you can compare these things. I wanted to show an example where this is particularly evident, so I thought I'd highlight JS8 call. When you look at the mode menu in JS8 call, you can choose 4 different speeds. The nominal speed, the normal one, is the same timing as FT8. So that's a 15-second transmit window. It takes about 50 hertz of bandwidth and gives you 16 words per minute, which is just slow enough to be annoying. So after a while, some people ask, should we have it faster? And you can see that JS8 can go all the way up to 40 words a minute, but you get an increase in bandwidth and you get a decrease in the transmission window. It also makes it harder to detect for some reasons I'll go into in a minute. And then one time I had a really great conversation with the guy on a compromised antenna with very small amount of power. We had to use JS8 in slow mode. And so that slows all the way down to 30 seconds per window and only 8 words per minute. But we were able to successfully rag chew for about 45 minutes that way. So it was quite fun. Another important difference between modes has to do with how they present on the band. So we can talk about the spectral density or power density of a mode. And you can think of this as being basically watts per hertz over time. In general, if you have poor propagation, you want to have a narrower signal so that you concentrate the power put out by your transmitter into a small space. What that does, it has the effect of increasing your signal to noise ratio substantially. And so that means higher spectral density is better for weak signal performance. You can't go too narrow because you might have other factors that you care about. If you're trying to transfer files or something over a digital mode, you don't want to go super narrow and have a small baud rate because it's going to take you forever to communicate. But under certain conditions, especially if propagation is poor, then spectral density is something to think about. This is, in a way, this is part of why CW punches through poor propagation so much better than SSB, because it has an extremely narrow signal, and the signal is transmitted for relatively long periods of time. And that means you have high spectral density. It shows up with a great signal to noise ratio. Another thing to think about is duty cycle. So Anthony was talking about how with FT8, you can't run at full bore on your transmitter because FT8 is a high duty cycle mode. But higher duty cycle means you're putting power out at a higher level more consistently, which means more spectral density, which means more detectability. So some modes give you a trade-off between these things. For an example, I wanted to show one of my favorite modes, which is Hellschreiber. Rudolf Hell wanted journalists to be able to send articles to the newspaper over bad telephone lines and sketchy RF links back in the 1920s. And so he came up with a very fascinating solution, and some people even consider him a co-inventor of the pixel. And so Hellschreiber has been around for a long time, but the classic version of Hellschreiber you can see on the left, it's a CW mode. It's actually not any different from CW Morse code, except instead of international Morse, we're transmitting pixels. When the carrier is present, it's a one color pixel, and when the carrier is not there, it's another color pixel. And you can see that because of that, you get these characteristic keying sidebands. And because the way fonts usually work, we end up with a duty cycle around 20 to 30%. That means 70% of the time, your transmitter is not transmitting. That's less net power in your signal over time, and it's spread out a little bit on the band because of the keying. Whereas if you swap that for a more modern version of Hellschreiber, FSK105, which uses frequency shift keying, well, now it's almost 100%. There's a little bit of downtime in frequency shifts, but it's something like 80 or 90% duty cycle. And this gives you much higher spectral density. And actually, because you're just moving the carrier, you're not turning it off and back on again, it narrows up the keying sideband. So now, these days, the Feldhell Club does their net in FSK 105 instead of using the classic Feldhell, because propagation isn't so great these days. You need something with narrower spectral density and a higher duty cycle. So a lot of times the way this would show up is if you're looking through your menu of modes, if you know that you need to punch through some interference or bad propagation, then you might choose the narrower one. Might be a slower speed, but it's going to punch through a lot better. Another thing worth talking about in these digital modes is error correction. And actually, I came up, Don, with what I think is kind of a fun analogy. I realized that digital modes are not the only thing that we do as ham radio operators that have forward error correction. In fact, a few months ago, when I was activating a park with Parks on the Air out on a campsite in Alabama, I used some forward error correction in my SSB voice. So forward error correction is when you add extra data so that the other side can recognize when there are errors and correct. Right? So if I get on SSB voice and I say N5HXR, that's my call sign, maybe somebody doesn't hear the difference between N and an M, a November and a Mike. Well, the use of the phonetic alphabet is actually a form of forward error correction. We add extra information that helps the recipient repair errors in reception and make sure that they get the right message. So forward error correction in a digital mode is the same thing, just with a little bit more mathematical rigor. And some forward error correction schemes actually make it so that you either get a perfect message or no message at all. And then some other ones, you might get some corruption in the message, but still get a whole bunch of it. And you'll find that most of the more interesting digital modes these days do use forward error correction. So FT8 does, WSPR does, JS8 does, of course, because it's FT8. But then some modes I think are very interesting. My highlight on the right here is Domino EX, which actually makes it optional. So you can run it with or without forward error correction. So if you're interested to see what the difference is like, that's a good one to pull out and spend a little time maybe with somebody on a SCED, sending and receiving a little bit with forward error correction, and then turn it off and see how that is. You find that it takes longer to send your message, but you can get your message through more reliably, especially if the conditions are poor. Finally, and I think this is where a lot of the creativity and expressivity in the modes comes from, is in different modulations. I already talked a little bit about how CW does not necessarily mean Morse code. A lot of people certainly think it does, but CW just means an on-off keyed continuous wave signal. And that could be a digital mode too. And Hellschreiber is a perfect example of that, where we activate the carrier for white pixels and we deactivate the carrier for black pixels, or whatever, however we want to render it. But then also a good number of the modes use frequency shift keying, where we just change the frequency of the carrier. And here is lots and lots of variety. So you can choose how many frequencies you use, or even what the meaning of the frequency changes would be. And I even mentioned on the fourth bullet there, incremental shift keying is fascinating because it's designed so that you change the frequency based on what the last one was. And what it means is, the way it's designed, if you look at a mode like Thor or Domino, you'll see that it's impossible to ever have the same frequency, two symbols in a row. And so that means that you're more resilient to multipath interference or intersymbol interference and some other neat things that can happen. What I wanted to point out for these is there are relative merits for each of the different modes. But one very fascinating one, because I'm interested in the homebrew side of things, is that there are implications for your hardware or your software. One of the things that I find interesting is that FT8 is a frequency shift keyed mode. It is not a linear mode. It's a nonlinear mode, which means you actually don't need to have a linear amplifier to use it. So when we were talking earlier, Anthony was saying you can't use your transceiver at maximum power. Well, that a lot of the reason for that is that you're actually burning a lot of extra power in order to give it a linear amplification, when you could actually do direct synthesis of the carrier wave, and you could change its frequency and run it through a nonlinear amplifier, and it actually worked just fine. So I found, for example, with Hellschreiber, I can make a Hellschreiber transmitter that uses a nonlinear amplifier that can operate in class C, D, E, or F, and end up with much more efficiency, 80 to 90% efficiency. And actually, you can run at maximum power depending on your hardware. So some of these decisions about modulation may actually give the hardware designer some extra expressivity in choosing what technology makes the most sense for a particular situation. Of course, the big advantage for digital modes and why they're so popular the last few years is because they perform so well with bad propagation. You can see here, for example, if you're having difficulty making your contact on single sideband, you might switch to CW and try some Morse code. But if that doesn't work, you can make double-digit dB gains by switching to a digital mode. And this is, of course, why FT8 is so extremely popular. It works extremely well. And to put this, if you're not so fluent in thinking decibels, this would be another way of looking at it. If you have 5 watts on WSPR, then you give or take, all other things being equal, there's a little waving of the hands here, but we can imagine that has roughly the same ability to make contact or deliver the message as SSB on 25 kilowatts. Right. So this I think explains a lot of the popularity of these things. So I don't think just the weak signal performance is enough to make digital modes interesting. They're interesting in their own right for all kinds of other reasons too. Here's an example of some really great, I thought, weak signal performance. I put together a 100 milliwatt station. This takes output from WSJTX, goes into the board in the top right, and that's an SSB exciter. So that generates the single sideband output. I run that into a driver amplifier just to the left of it. set it up for 100 milliwatts, and I had decodes in Europe and off in the Pacific. And this was not the last screenshot I had. I got the really far ones. I was really surprised how much I could do with 0.1 watts. So really neat stuff you can do with some of these digital modes. And I will point out, so Whisper is pretty awesome. It's difficult to do a keyboard-to-keyboard conversation. But in fact, though FT8 is a few dB better than, say, Domino or Thor, Domino and Thor can get you an interactive keyboard conversation and a full rag chew, oftentimes in exactly the same conditions that you might choose FT8 instead. So if you're into rag chewing, some of these digital modes compete very well with FT8 and can be quite effective. If I'm looking at the band, how do I know what digital mode somebody is using? There are literally dozens of them, and probably even more. Well, so one option is the Reed-Solomon identification. So if you configure your software well, and hopefully if the other guy does too, there's a little burst of data packet that goes before your transmission, which identifies the mode. And a lot of the software out there, FLDigi, and I think HRD does too, they will read that Reed-Solomon identifier, and you can configure the software to automatically switch to the mode that's coming in. That makes it a lot easier to find it. Not everybody uses it, and it doesn't always come through cleanly. But another option is the Signal Identification Wiki. This has a lot of stuff that's not even amateur radio on it. This is an excellent site to see what a lot of these modes look like on the waterfall. Once you get the hang of how the general families of modes work, it's not too hard to figure out one and maybe make a couple guesses. If someone calls CQ at least 5 times, then you'll have a chance at guessing whether it's Olivia or Thor. There are different features that are quite identifiable between them. And you say, well, all the digital modes sound cool, but nobody uses them, so it doesn't matter that they're cool. Well, actually, people do use them, but it is kind of hard to find them. And I have found it quite frustrating because there's this awesome opportunity to have all kinds of rag chews. And I just wish it was easier to find people. It's not like FT8 where you know what frequency it's going to be, and there's probably already a million people trying it. So one thing that I found seems to work okay is to not be too committed on which mode I want to use, but to be conversant in a few of them. And I watched the WebSDRs, a few different ones around the country, and I look to see if I see somebody having a conversation on a digital mode. Maybe I see something that looks Olivia-ish, or it looks PSK31-ish. Then I'll go hop over there, figure out which mode they're using, and then move a little bit to the side, far enough to not be a jerk, but close enough that people would see it on the same waterfall. And then I'll start calling CQ. And every once in a while, you get a group of people together. There are also some enthusiast groups. I'm a member of the Feldhell Club on Facebook, so you can see a lot of info about activity with the group there, or you can self-spot on sites like HamSpot. Ultimately, I personally would like to see a lot more conversational rag chewing use of these awesome digital modes. With that, that's all I have prepared.
Josh, thank you very, very much. As usual, you've left our heads spinning with lots to think about, and you accomplished your mission of you directly answered the question of why so many modes and how would you pick? But in doing so, you gave us a context to understand that FT8 is one among several. And the modes exist for multiple use cases. And some of them are very good to strike up a conversation and have a nice chat.